Hello, and welcome to another of our short teach-ins, looking at some technical issues around agricultural tenancies. Now, my name is George Dunn. I'm the Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association, and I'm going to be your host for this session. So today's session is part of a series of teach-ins which try to shine a spotlight on those topical issues being faced by tenant farmers and the tenanted sector of agriculture more widely. It's part of our growing YouTube library, which also features webinars and news updates from the past and previous weeks. Today, we've got Caroline Squire, who's one of our expert rural surveyors here at the TFA, and she's going to be talking us through what we mean by tenants fixtures and what we mean by tenants improvements and how they are treated at the end of tenancy within the different types of tenancy agreement that exist. But before we start, I should say that we're delighted to be sponsored and supported by Oxbury Bank, who have agreed to sponsor our entire 2023 virtual program of events and teach-in sessions like this one. For those of you who don't know Oxbury, they were formed in 2021, funded by a collaboration of bankers, farmers, and technologists, and they are the UK's only bank which is 100% dedicated to serving farmers, food producers, and the rural economy. Okay, so to today. We're looking at this issue on tenants fixtures and tenants improvements in the summer of 2023. So everything we cover today is correct at the time of recording. If you have any questions or any advice on your individual circumstances, we would certainly recommend you call the TFA to ask one of its advisors, like Caroline, to give you advice on your individual circumstances. So I'm going to introduce you to Caroline, who, as I have said, is one of the TFA's specialist rural surveyors, and she's going to talk you through some of the key points to consider when dealing with tenants fixtures and tenants improvements. So welcome, Caroline. Over to you.
Thank you very much, George. So I thought firstly we would start by looking at tenants improvements. So tenants improvements have the written consent of the landlord to be treated as an improvement, and their treatment differs slightly between the Agricultural Holdings Act and the Agricultural Tenancies Act, which governs farm business tenancies. So if at first we look at the Agricultural Holdings Act, under the AHA, a tenant is obliged to leave their improvements behind at the end of tenancy in return for compensation. Now, the compensation may be conditional, so the consent itself may set out the conditions, and write-downs are permitted under the Agricultural Holdings Act. So that would be writing down the compensation for the improvement to a nominal sum over a period of time. And the period of time ought to reflect the lifespan of the improvement. However, if consent is unconditional, then the statutory basis for compensation would apply, which is an amount equal to the increase attributable to the improvement in the value of the agricultural holding as a holding, having regard to the character and situation of the holding and the average requirements of tenants reasonably skilled in husbandry. So, therefore, because the character and situation of the holding are taken into account on the statutory basis of compensation, just as an example, a grain store on an arable farm would receive a good amount of compensation because it's in keeping with the character and situation of the holding, whereas a specialised llama shed, for example, on what would usually be farmed as an arable farm would not be considered in keeping with the character or situation of the holding, and hence it would attract a much lower compensation value. In some circumstances, it is possible to apply to the tribunal for consent for an improvement if the landlord either refuses consent or offers consent with unreasonable conditions attached. But this is an expensive route, and it is only possible for certain improvements. So that would be things including extending, altering and erecting new buildings, installing land drainage, or improving roads and bridges. So moving on to farm business tenancies governed by the Agricultural Tenancies Act, improvements under FBTs So the tenant has the right to claim compensation for physical improvements and intangible advantages. And that's something which can't physically be touched, but brings a benefit to the holding. So a good example would be planning permission. And unless the terms of the consent for the improvement under an FBT require the tenant to leave the improvement behind at the end of the tenancy, the tenant can actually remove the improvement at any time during the term, provided that they do make the site good after removal. However, in numerous cases, the consent will require the tenant to leave the improvement behind at the end of tenancy, and in which case the tenant will be compensated for leaving it behind. So under FBTs, compensation can be capped, although write-downs are not permitted. So that's quite a distinction between AHA and FBT improvements. The minimum cap for compensation under an FBT is the initial cost of the improvement, and the compensation payable will either be the cap or the statutory basis, whichever one is less. And the statutory basis is the increase attributable to the improvement in the value of the holding at the termination of the tenancy as land comprised within the tenancy. So in other words, what the improvement is worth to an incoming tenant. And usually you would calculate that by assessing the rental value of the holding with and without the improvement, and then capitalising the difference. Under the Agricultural Tenancies Act, if the landlord won't grant consent for an improvement, depending on the terms of the tenancy, it may be referred to arbitration. And the arbitrator will then make an award which will deem whether or not the tenant has been deemed to be granted consent for the improvement. So moving on to tenants' fixtures now. Tenants' fixtures either do not have the written consent of the landlord, or they have the written consent on the condition that they are to be treated as a fixture. And for fixtures, the landlord is not obliged to take them over at the end of the tenancy or pay compensation for them. And again, they are treated slightly differently under the Agricultural Holdings Act and the Agricultural Tenancies Act. So if we look at the Agricultural Holdings Act first, at the end of the tenancy, the tenant is obliged to offer their fixtures to the landlord by serving a Section 10 notice. And the landlord then has the option to either let the tenant remove the fixture and make the site good after removal, or to serve a counter notice requiring the tenant to leave the fixtures behind. And if the landlord does require the tenant to leave the fixtures behind, then they will pay compensation, and that will be the fair value to an incoming tenant. Under an FBT, the tenant is actually free to remove their fixtures at any time during the tenancy up until the end of the agreement, provided they make the site good after removal. However, if the tenant wishes to leave their fixtures behind rather than remove them, they're free to approach the landlord and try to do a deal. However, compensation is purely down to negotiation, and the landlord isn't obliged to agree or take on the fixture. So the worst case scenario for fixtures under both the Agricultural Holdings Act and the Agricultural Tenancies Act would potentially be the tenant having fixtures which are difficult and costly to remove. So whether that's miles of fencing, an underground dirty water system, a concrete yard, whatever it may be, if it's difficult to remove, the landlord could call the tenant's bluff and say they don't wish to take over the fixture, knowing full well that the tenant is probably going to leave it behind because of the time and cost and hassle involved in removing it, in which case they could take over the fixture for free. And even worse again, if the landlord truly didn't want the fixture, they could then potentially dilapidate the tenant for the cost of removing it and making good, if at the end of the tenancy they did actually follow through and remove the fixture and make the site good afterwards. So that's certainly something to be aware of.
Caroline, my word, that is a complex area, isn't it? The legalities of this and the compensation issues and all of the issues that seem to be surrounding this. So yeah, I can see this is an area where good advice is going to be necessary. So when you are advising TFA members about investing in fixed equipment on the holding, do you say that it's best for them to try and get their investment treated as a tenant's fixture or as a tenant's improvement?
So it will completely depend on the item. If it's something which is difficult to remove and take with you at the end of the tenancy, then it would be best for it to be treated as an improvement so that it can be left behind and the tenant will be paid compensation. But if the item is something relatively easy to remove, it would be useful to take away with the tenant at the end of the tenancy, and perhaps it would make better money if sold secondhand on the open market. Then it would be advisable to have it treated as a fixture so that the tenant is able to remove it and take it with them at the end of the tenancy, provided obviously they make the site good afterwards.
So it all very much depends on the individual circumstances of each case. You talked about write-down periods under the Agricultural Holdings Act agreements, which writes down the level of compensation based on how much money has been spent on that investment. So any advice about how long those write-down periods ought to be?
Yes, so again, that will depend on the improvement because the write-down period ought to reflect the individual improvement's lifespan. Typically, we find landlords agents do try to push for shorter write-down periods to reduce their liability for paying compensation, but that's something to negotiate on and it should marry up with the lifespan. Just as an example, a new agricultural building should easily have, say, a 30-year lifespan. So therefore, the write-down period ought to be 30 years to reflect that. And the write-down period also does need to be long enough to justify the tenant's investment, because the end of tenancy compensation is never going to reflect the initial cost of installing the improvement. So it's important to think about how much longer you're likely to be at the farm and whether the initial outlay is going to be recouped by your use of the improvement.
Okay, and finally, before we let you go, Caroline, obviously within the AHA, the Agricultural Holdings Act system, we've got succession tenancies where those tenancies can be taken over by the close relatives of retiring or deceased tenants. Is it necessary in those circumstances to ensure that any improvements in fixtures from the previous AHA tenancy are rolled on and written into the new succession agreement?
Yes, so that's really important to ensure that all tenants' improvements and fixtures are rolled into the new succession agreement and clearly noted within the new tenancy agreement, so it's clear which items belong to the tenant. And that's important, firstly, in terms of rent reviews, because if they belong to the tenant, they are disregarded at rent review. And also for end of tenancy compensation, so that the tenant is either free to take them away with them at the end of the tenancy or be compensated for them. If the improvements and fixtures are not rolled onto the new agreement, then the legal fallback position is that they would revert to the landlord, in which case the succession tenant would end up paying rent on them, and also they wouldn't receive any end of tenancy compensation. So it is really important that they are rolled forward onto the new agreement and clearly documented within the new agreement.
Caroline, that's great. And whilst you've answered quite a lot of questions, no doubt there will be individuals out there with a host of other questions that they want to ask. And if you do have more questions about your individual position, you can become a member of the TFA and get specific advice from our team of rural surveyors, just like Caroline. Membership is good value for money. It's just £249 per year. And that gives you access to dedicated advice, information, and support from our expert surveyors. So you can find out more about how to join the TFA at the end of this teaching, and you can click the link to the link which will take you to how to join the TFA. So we hope you have found this teaching useful today. As mentioned, it's part of a library which you can access through our YouTube channel. So don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any content as we post it. Many thanks again to Oxbury for sponsoring our virtual program this year and our teachings as well. Our main webinars will return in September of this year, 2023, And our first webinar back will be looking at the 2023 Sustainable Farming Incentive rollout for farmers in England. It's going to feature Janet Hughes, who's the program director from DEFRA. She is a regular attender at our webinars, and also the recently appointed RPA customer director, Maria Hardman. So details for how to register for that free webinar will be on the TFA website for you to access. So it only remains for me to thank Caroline for her expert advice today and to wish you all very well, all the very best.